So thank you for listening to this presentation. I'm going to be talking about the relationship between dementia, not having family support, and communication. And I'll be drawing to some extent on the ideas in my two books from 2020 and 2021. I'm going to start with a general outline of what dementia is, and then consider whether not having children might increase your risk of getting dementia, and if so, why that might be. I'll then ask where communication fits into this picture, given that my specialism is in communication. That will lead into thinking about what communication is like with those that you are close to. And then I'll consider whether there might be any advantages to not having family support. And that will lead into considering the importance of future-proofing yourself if you don't have family support. And then in the final slide, there are three discussion questions that might help to think a little bit more about these topics. Dementia is common. There is lots of it around, probably more than we know because a lot of it isn't diagnosed. And of all the different risks there are for developing dementia, the single biggest risk factor is age. We tend to think of dementia as being a disease, but it isn't. It's the symptoms of a number of different brain diseases, each of which attack different part of the brain in a different kind of way. And so, not surprisingly, dementia is different according to which disease it is. So we're very familiar, for example, with memory impairment as a feature of Alzheimer's disease. And the reason for that is that the damage that Alzheimer's disease causes to the brain starts in the hippocampus in the brain, and that's the place where memories for things that have recently happened are laid down for longer retention. And so that is difficult for people with Alzheimer's to do. And that's why they can have difficulty recalling things like what they did earlier on in the day. But there are other types of symptoms that will occur with different types of disease. For example, in some types of dementia, it could be memories from longer ago that are difficult to recall. Pretty well all of the types of dementia are associated with reduced processing speed, and that's because all of these diseases, by attacking the functions of the brain, by attacking the brain itself and therefore the way it functions, are actually making it harder for information to flow around the brain. And there are then language difficulties as well, which I'll come back to when I talk about communication. There isn't any treatment, no cure as yet for dementia-causing diseases, but there are various kinds of treatments that can help to some extent. There are a number of drugs that are given to people who have certain types of dementia, which aim to slow down the progress of the disease. There are also medications for some of the symptoms that are often associated with dementia, caused by it, if you like. Such as depression, for example. And then there's also medication for conditions that can either exacerbate dementia symptoms or might increase the risk of getting dementia. For example, heart disease. In fact, if you go to the websites for dementia and try to see what should I do in order to minimize my chance of getting dementia, the advice really is do the same things that you would to minimize your chance of getting heart disease. So that's a healthy diet, exercise, and so on. It's clear that some people are more vulnerable to dementia-causing diseases than others are. So why might that be? Well, there is a hereditary element to it, but it's not as simple as thinking that there is a gene for Alzheimer's, say. It's much more complicated. It seems that lots of genes might play a small role in the vulnerability that individuals have to developing a dementia-causing disease such as Alzheimer's disease. This can be quite hard to get your head around. How can lots of genes play a small role in it? It's a bit like this. Imagine that your next door neighbor said, oh, last year I had so many apples from my garden that I was making pies and chutneys and freezing it and giving them away and so on. And this year I've got hardly any apples at all. And you think about, well, what might be the reason why the neighbor's got so few apples? And the chances are it's not down to just one thing. It could be that there was a late frost just when the blossoms were setting, so that killed a few of the blossoms off. It could be that there was a particularly dry spring or wet spring, a particularly hot summer or whatever that undermined the capacity of the apples to develop that year. It could also be that there's a bit of disease in the tree that might mean that some of the leaves curl and the fruit doesn't develop so well. It could be there's a bit of disease in the ground. It could also be that the birds got to them this year for some reason. And it could even be that your neighbors went on holiday for 2 weeks just when the apples were ready, and a lot of them fell on the ground and rotted or were eaten by foxes or whatever. So there might be lots of different reasons that all play part of a role in why there are not many apples this year. And perhaps it's a little bit similar for how one's vulnerability to developing a dementia-causing disease can arise from a number of different genes. It could be that some people's environment makes them more vulnerable than others. There's been a lot of research done on this over the years. When I was a child, it was all about whether aluminium saucepans caused Alzheimer's and so on. When it comes to culture, it does seem that dementia is much more common in some cultures than others. And this could be to do with something in that culture that changes vulnerability to the disease itself. But it's quite likely that a lot of it is to do with how the culture responds to the signs of dementia. In some cultures, it's simply accepted that older people might be a bit more confused, might be a bit slower, and that's kind of absorbed into the way that they are supported and helped, whereas in other cultures they get ostracized and therefore it becomes more obvious. There has been some research suggesting that dementia-causing diseases might be due to infections that cross the blood-brain barrier and therefore get into the cerebral spinal fluid. For example, there was research just 3 or 4 years ago about the role that gum disease might play. The bacteria that cause gingivitis in the gums have been found, I think, in cerebral spinal fluid, and there was some thought that they might play a role in the development of, I think it was Alzheimer's. Injuries do seem to increase people's risk of developing dementia-causing diseases. We're well aware of the risks of boxing, heading footballs, playing rugby, and so on. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised that if you bash your brain around a lot, that it might damage it. But there's also another way of looking at this, and this is to do with the kinds of protection that people might have from these diseases and the effects of them. And this can be talked of in terms of the term reserve. So one type of reserve is called neural or brain reserve. And what this really means is that some people seem to have more brain cells and more connected up. So they've got more connections between brain cells than other people have. Now, you can think about this as being a bit like a road map in a busy city such as London. If you look at that map and you think, well, if I wanted to go from one place to another and the main route that I might usually use is blocked, there's always going to be a lot of other roads that I could use to get round to there. That's what the taxi drivers know, of course. And what that means is, in terms of the brain, if you've got a lot of connections and one particular connection is difficult to use now, there's a good chance that there are alternative routes to achieve the same effect. And that means to say that essentially the brain can absorb a little bit of damage without it really affecting function. Linked to that is the idea of cognitive reserve. This is more like the software angle, whereas the one I was just talking about is more like the hardware. So it doesn't matter how many connections you've got between brain cells if you're not used to using them. If you've got a particular route that you always take to get from home to the supermarket, and that road is blocked, it doesn't really matter how many other roads there are round the back that would give you another route. If you don't know what they are, you're not used to navigating them, you're not confident navigating them. And so cognitive reserve is about using those brain connections by thinking things through, solving puzzles and so on. It's the main reason why there's this idea of use it or lose it, and brain training, to keep your brain in use so that you are accustomed to finding ways round if there's a difficulty in making a particular connection. Now, I want to mention briefly two other types of reserve which come from my own research. You won't find them anywhere else as yet. One of them is called social reserve. Now, this regards the extent to which an individual who has developed a dementia-causing disease, such as Alzheimer's or vascular dementia, is able to live well with the symptoms of that disease because they have adequate social support in their environment. Now, this in part is about family and friends who can sort them, help them and support them, but it's not just that. It's also about the inherent infrastructure. How easy is it to get information? How easy is it to see the right doctor? How easy is it to get the bank or the utility services to understand that with dementia symptoms, it might be a little bit more difficult for you to achieve certain kinds of transactions. And similarly, the way the media presents dementia, what does that tell the general population, so that when you're in a supermarket, if you have a little bit of dementia, how do people behave towards you? How does your hairdresser behave? How does your taxi driver behave? All of this is part of social reserve, and people who are able to access a high level of social reserve, a lot of support from all these different sources, are more likely to live well with dementia, and their symptoms won't develop as quickly. And then linked to that is the final type of reserve, emotional reserve. And this regards how well a person can cope with having a dementia diagnosis, adapt to their life in the ways they need to change their life, and stay positive about it. And high emotional reserve is partly to do with personality, but it's also partly to do with the social reserve. It's easier to feel positive and if you feel supported by other people. So should we consider that not having children would increase your risk of getting dementia? I should mention, first of all, that when I say not having children, that can mean several different things, can't it? It can mean literally not having any physical children of your own. It could mean having children, but they're not available or they're not involved. Or it could mean not have anybody to take on the role that a child might take on if you become more needy as you get older. So not having anybody to support you. And I'm not going to resolve that, because I think that is part of the bigger picture, is that when somebody feels under-supported, it's not just about whether they specifically have children to support them. Now, there is some research that suggests that dementia is more prevalent in those without children. And this is really quite interesting. Why would that be? Let's think through some of the possible reasons why that might be. Is it possible that there is something about physically giving birth, if you're a woman, or child rearing, that affects your susceptibility to getting a dementia-causing disease? That seems pretty unlikely to me. I can't see what that connection would be. Could it be to do with lifestyle differences? Are people who have children and grandchildren more healthy, fitter, and so on, eat a better diet? Again, I don't think that if you were to divide the population of older people up into those who were very fit and healthy and those who were less so, that it would necessarily map onto whether they had children or not. Could it be that childless people live longer? As I mentioned earlier, one of the risk factors for dementia is age. So if you live longer, you're more likely to have dementia. Again, I can't see why we would think that childless people would live longer. What seems much more likely to me is that having family around you is one significant way in which your social reserve can be enhanced. And that means to say, not that you are any less likely to develop a dementia-causing disease, but that you might actually be able to live with a low level of dementia for longer. And this comes in several forms. One is your outward role as a continuing as a provider and supporter, because you're a parent. You always have a sense of having that role. You have all the worry about your kids and your grandkids and all the joy and so on. And you see children, you see younger people, which of course is not necessarily the case if you don't have family of your own. Meanwhile, of course, you also have the inward coming aspect of social reserve, so that others support you. And also that you have, if you like, the right to socially connect. That if you have children, it's kind of maybe a bit more okay to pick up the phone and expect to talk to them. Whereas if you don't have close family, although you may have friends, perhaps you don't feel in the same way that you have the right to expect to be in touch with them. It could also be that when there are families are there, the symptoms are managed away or covered up, and therefore you get a later diagnosis. Now, this is relevant because some of the research that has been done that might suggest that dementia is more prevalent in those without children. The way that this is sometimes done is to get medical records, look at the people who've got a dementia diagnosis, look at how old they were when they got the diagnosis, and then see whether they have children or not. And if they would find in this research that those without children had a diagnosis at an earlier age, then that would be translated into saying that dementia was more prevalent, where in fact that might not be the case. It could be that people with and without children are equally likely to get dementia-causing diseases at a given age, but that not everybody will get to a memory clinic and get diagnosed at the same age. So that could be part of the explanation. Does not having children make having dementia harder once you have developed a dementia-causing disease? To answer that, we have to think about what children or other types of family supporters or friends might do that's important. Now, contrary to what I just said, one of the things that might happen is that other people, your close family or friends, would notice symptoms and encourage you to have an investigation and go to a memory clinic, in which case, and notwithstanding what I said on the previous slide, it could be that it would be diagnosed a bit earlier and therefore dealt with a little bit earlier. One of the things that close family, very often it is children, will go with their mum, with their dad to a medical appointment, take the notes, ask the questions. If somebody's got an early stage of dementia, then it can be quite difficult to just keep up with all of the information and keep it all and retain it all. Family might also be checking on the person's general well-being, popping in with shopping, solving problems, and so on. Take on power of attorney. It's kind of obvious that your children would do that if they're available. And children and other family members are able to anticipate the needs of a person with dementia because they know them well. And therefore they might be able to make connections to others. So say, oh, you know, I know that my mum likes a spoonful of sugar in her coffee. Whereas if you haven't got anybody who knows that about you, then that's not going to get conveyed. Also, knowing who their friends are, facilitating connections. So they might say, oh, yeah, I know my mum loves doing a jigsaw puzzle. So if you've got one out, if you invite her around for a cup of tea, she'll come and help you, and that kind of thing, just making those connections. Whereas if you don't know, I don't have anybody who's that close, they don't necessarily know to do that. And then family might also be doing a lot of practical kind of support, like if professional carers are needed to go in, they might be doing the hiring of those. They might be finding experts to sort out the TV when it goes wrong, or home repairs and finance and so on. And then finally, one of the things that family often do is to be the ones who bridge a financial gap, maybe by doing a certain amount of care themselves, or by paying the shortfall for residential care or for home care. Okay, so I want to move now to think a little bit about how communication fits into all this. Dementia directly affects communication in a number of ways. One thing we're very aware of is word finding issues, isn't it? Not being able to think of the word when you want it. Sometimes in some types of dementia, not recognizing words when they're spoken, or recognizing the word and not recalling the meanings. This different ones of these in different types of dementia. Another thing that can happen is repeating what's been said already. And that's a classic thing that we find in Alzheimer's, for example. Not following conversations. So the person living with dementia is sitting in a group of others and it's just going beyond them. They can't follow the conversation. They can't make the connections fast enough to work out who's being talked about or what's being talked about. Not recalling who people are and therefore not being sure how to address them. If you see somebody, recognize them, but you're not quite sure what their role is, it's very hard to know how to address them. I mean, is this your hairdresser or your chiropodist? It makes a difference to what you say to them. And not recalling and tracking information. So if you can't recall all of the information that's been said already in a conversation because you're not following it and you can't track it, then it makes it very difficult to keep up and to feed relevant information into a conversation. So what kind of effect do these problems have? Well, there's difficulty with language, memory, and general processing, as I mentioned, and this means that it's difficult to keep up with the context in which the conversation is being held. Now, when we communicate, what we're doing a lot of the time is trying to work out what the other person already knows. And we don't want to tell them what they already know. We want to refer to what they already know and add to it by saying the bit that they don't already know. So we have this kind of map of the world of our experiential world, if you like, in which there is information that I know and you don't, information that I believe you know but I don't, and then an overlap of what we both know. And a lot of what's going on in communication is trying to shift stuff from the outside inwards. So I will tell you something that I believe you don't already know, so that it goes into the what we both know part. And if I think you know something that I don't, I might ask you a question so that you will shift information into the middle. Now, when somebody's got a dementia, that destabilizes that map. And the reason is that gaps are arising in the knowledge that the person has. So there are things that you believe they ought to know, and so you ask them about them, but they have a gap where that knowledge should be. You say, you know, what did you have for lunch today? And they can't recall because they haven't laid that memory down. But also, as you see, there will be gaps in the information that you both know or are both supposed to know. And that means to say that the person with dementia might tell you things that you already know because they don't realize, because they've got a gap there. They don't realize that you already know it. And they might also, and you also might be unsure what they still remember and what they don't, what they know and what they don't know. You know, they ought to be shared knowledge. So you're not quite sure whether to remind them about something or whether that would be patronizing because they do already recall it. So it means that neither party is sure what the other person does and doesn't know, and therefore what knowledge does and doesn't need to be stated. And what this means then is that there are mismatches in expectations about what each person thinks the other person knows and should be telling them. And this can very easily lead to a whole range of different, rather negative experiences that I think we very often do associate with communicating with a person who's living with a dementia, that these misunderstandings, this frustration, and the anger and the depression that comes from communication just not working. And that's the reason why, is that there's a mismatch of the understanding about what it's appropriate to say at a particular time. Now, you might think, well, does having children alleviate all of this? I think it probably doesn't. And here's the reason. If you think about somebody who knows you very well, you're communicating with your nearest and dearest, the better you know somebody, the more likely it is that you can guess the context, the information that perhaps they can't recall. Now, that's a good thing, because it means that if there is a gap, there's more of a chance that you can help to fill it. But on the other hand, when the gap can't be filled, it's going to bother you more. You know, you have much more of a sense that there ought not to be that gap, because you know what should be in it. And the more likely you are to know better. So, for example, if you say, "Oh, I'm popping down to Brighton," and the person with dementia says, "Oh, I've never been to Brighton," and you know, if that's your mum or your dad, just, "Yes, you have. You've been to Brighton loads of time. We used to go on there on holiday. Don't you remember?" "Oh no, I've never been to Brighton." And you know better than them, because you recall that thing. And also, the more you're likely to care about being right, it becomes a kind of a battle of wills almost. Compare that to the other extreme of having a conversation with a complete stranger, such as a professional carer. That kind of person shares a lot less context, as a result of which, if the person says something like, "Oh, I saw the lady who lives down the road," that stranger isn't going to be able to fill that information in like a family member might be able to. But on the other hand, they're much less likely to contradict and cause any friction. So if the professional carer says, "Oh, I'm going to Brighton next week. Have you ever been to Brighton?" and the person living with the dementia says, "No, I've never been to Brighton," they're not going to say, "Yes, you have." They're going to say, "Oh, that's a pity. I'm sure you would have enjoyed it." As a result of which, there is much less of that kind of conflict. They're much less emotionally invested. So if the communication doesn't work all that well, they'll probably just move on and change the subject. It doesn't really matter, because there's nothing, they haven't got anything to prove, if you like. And they can, of course, because they're professional, they can more easily just give up and walk away if the conversation isn't working. Whereas a family member will know that they've got to go back in and engage, and they're trying to get this mum or this dad back out from where they've got lost, if you like. So we might wonder whether there are any advantages to not relying on others. One of the things, if you haven't got family support, whether it's children or siblings or a partner, whatever, is that you are kind of forced into a kind of self-determination and independence. If you believe that something is the best decision for you, nobody's going to contradict that. So you can just get on and be independent. You also have a massive impetus to keep going and take responsibility for your own life. You haven't got a family member saying, "Look, you know, I can sort that out for you. Just sit back, I'll sort that out." There's nobody to do that for you. There's also no guilt about burdening others. I think a lot of people who do have children are quite concerned about the amount of burden that they potentially will put onto them. On the other hand, it has to be said that dementia is genuinely debilitating, and it's not something that you can necessarily manage long-term on your own. And it will affect your judgment, which means to say that all those great ideas that you have about how you should sort your life out, if you did have somebody around you, they might be saying, "Do you know what, that might not be such a good idea." It also co-occurs with other things that we have to deal with as we get older, illnesses and bereavements, which puts a massive, massive emotional burden and cognitive burden. And therefore, it does mean to say that if you do develop a dementia, it would be very difficult to manage longer term without some sort of help. And that means to say that it's really very important to future-proof, because if you don't, then who's going to? And the first aspect of that is probably thinking about facing up to the fact that you're aging. This is a really difficult thing, I think, for all of us to consider. We all feel 18 in our heads, and recognizing when it's time to start making decisions that are accommodating our future old age and potential vulnerability to something like dementia. When is the right time to start doing that? That's something we all have to think about. it's probably useful to identify some sort of advocate, a friend or a relative or a solicitor, somebody who you know you can trust, you can build up a relationship with of trust over a longer period. Probably a good idea to be alert to cognitive changes in yourself, not to spook yourself, but to just be aware of changes and have a plan for managing them. There are many things that we can do to help us continue to operate effectively. If you realize you're starting to forget your passwords, then rather than just trusting that you won't forget them anymore, you've got to write them down in a different kind of way or somewhere, or give them to a friend or something, so that you know that you can always access your passwords, for example. Knowing where to find support, finding things out now, what sorts of support is available, what are you likely to need, so that you're not having to scrabble around looking for it when you're already feeling vulnerable. Perhaps joining with others in a similar situation, perhaps like this group, Aging Without Children. So you are talking to others in a similar situation. That means that perhaps you can collaborate in future planning. You might have different skills that you can bring to the table and help each other. Sharing information that you've found out. Perhaps sharing resources. If several of you live close together and you all need a little bit of support from a professional carer, perhaps you could jointly employ one. Some people even get into communal living and perhaps have a live-in carer for them. And perhaps find ways to engage the local community, not just of older people, but of all ages, to develop the mechanisms for offering practical interventions and support. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say. It's rather open-ended because I think it is. And here are the discussion questions that I thought might be useful. To what extent do these issues cause you concern? How does one get beyond the anxiety to practical action? What steps have you already taken? And what role do you think that groups like Aging Without Children have? Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found that useful.